Hello, everyone, world of YouTube. Welcome to a new podcast that I figured I would start for the internet to enjoy. Um, if you follow my Instagram, I do these polls where I ask my viewers, or my followers. That's the proper word for people on Instagram. Which two albums fall under a particular umbrella better? It's rarely which is the better blank, but sometimes there's just such a contentious opinion between two albums under a very neat, very broad umbrella that you just need to talk about it. But usually I try to keep it a little more niche, a little more focused, and what better name for it than AVA, album versus album. And on this titular debut episode, we're going to be going out and talking about two records by two very colossal bands. One whose career was cut tragically short, and the other still thriving today, for better or for worse. I'm talking about two albums from the 1990s with a blue aesthetic on their cover that both had an impact on the scene for sure. But I'm gonna be talking about the merits of both records before talking about the one that I think is better and accomplished more in the long run. While one had an immediate shift, and you could argue one would not exist without the other because of the impact this one record made. But I feel like the following record was made sort of as a response to the impact this first record had. Without any more preamble and setup, I'm talking about Nirvana's second record, Nevermind, versus Weezer's debut, the 1994 record, The Blue Album. And I'll be talking about both records again, talking kind of a little bit about the impact both have had, or at least threads that you could see planted in some instances as far as impacting bands' sounds and what they sort of reinvigorated back into music. And obviously, to get it up front, everyone kind of knows the impact Nevermind's had. It's a record that really shook up the music industry in an immediate sort of way. You know, while there were other bands in their scene doing this grungy sound, they were the band to make it super successful. And that was in part due to the band's incredible ability to take these angry, gnashing sounds and make them so incredibly fucking catchy. You know, if you look at the track listing of both these records, you will see single after single after single after single. And and I'll get to Weezer's Blue Album in a second, Nevermind just struck this beautiful balance of aggression and catchy melody in a way that just throttled the zeitgeist into this disenfranchised embracing of, you know, lack of empathy towards the general populace. You know, grunge was in, and I mean, yeah, that's really the biggest thing you could take away from like the broad strokes that Nevermind painted. It helped throttle bands like Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden. It made their heroes stars. Like the Pixies were big, but I feel like they got another resurgence in popularity thanks to Nirvana, Mudhoney, another band from like that grungy scene, not the 90s, but that grungy scene that got a lot of immediate success. The Butthole Surfers got huge because, you know, people were into that angry, noisy rock, and Kurt Cobain liked the Butthole Surfers, so the Butthole Surfers got notoriety, and they finally had a hit, you know, in the 90s. And that's great. You know, I love the doors Nirvana opened and closed subsequently for some bands with the release of Nevermind, because it also really put the nail in the coffin for I gotta burp real quick. For hair metal music, which I don't hate hair metal. You know, I have a sort of a nostalgic love for the genre because it's something that, while my mom really liked angry, grungy music, I gotta burp again. Fuck, I'm so burpy. My apologies. She also had a love for grunge music, and while Nirvana isn't my favorite band of its scene,
nor is Nevermind my favorite record by Nirvana or of the grunge era. I owe a lot to this band. Like, one of the first songs I learned to play on drums was In Bloom. I fucking love a lot of the songs on Nevermind. I think that it's an incredible fucking record. And I feel like its impact is undeniable. And on the other side of that coin, Weezer's Blue Album, produced by Rick Ocasek, which Nevermind was produced by Butch Vig, who I would argue this is one of his better produced projects. I like the work he did with the Smashing Pumpkins. I think his production for them as well is very good. He made one of the best Foo Fighters records to date as well, Butch Vig. He's got a good ear for the sound of this record, and I feel like he helped them channel what they were sort of toying with on Bleach and make it into a huge success. And it's incredible. Like, I don't think Butch Vig is the best producer out there, but I think he got Nirvana's sound and got what they were going for, and he channeled it into this perfect storm of a record that, again, it's super fucking successful. Everybody knows Nevermind, and it's not hard to deny the success of that. But again, on the other side of that coin, we have Weezer's Blue Album, came out 3 years later. Nevermind was 91, this was 94. Kurt Cobain had passed away. And this little band that was getting an upstart in California got the Cars frontman, Rick Ocasek, to produce their debut album, which is I don't want to say it's an offshoot of the grunge sound, because it's really not. You can tell that they had similar inspirations from the disenfranchisement that Kurt Cobain and other bands of his genre were super preaching about, but they channeled it in a very different fashion. And one that I feel like also resonated very hard with the scene, not only because of Rivers' sound, but the band's sound as a whole. The guitars on this record are just so vibrant. The solo work on here is a lot more nuanced. The guitar is on here and the vocals on here are a lot more nuanced than what Nevermind was. It almost is a response to the grungy, gritty nature of Nevermind in a very clean sort of way. It's just as catchy. My Name is Jonas, Buddy Holly, Undone, Say It Ain't So. Undone having this meltdown in the end of it that has this sort of sound that feels very indebted to the 90s and, a lot of what the ordeals that grunge was had at its core, but in a completely different way. Holiday is another super catchy song. Both have super catchy moments. Just the albums themselves are very, very different in execution. But you could argue both had this incredible sound that throttled their relative scenes and helped sort of burgeon bands in their ilk. My apologies for those pops there. Burgeon bands of their ilk into bigger success. They both had resonance in music. And this whole podcast, but either by myself or with a guest, is going to go over each record and talk about whether my opinion versus my guest's opinion, where we both lie, and talk about where they both fit under the particular umbrella. And the umbrella that I sort of talked about in the beginning was the impact, the bigger impact in music as a whole. What was the bigger influence? What record do I think had the biggest long-term impact? Because you could throttle many other bands in the grunge scene to the success of grunge or post-grunge. But, and this is where I'm going to be injecting more of my opinion, I think Weezer's Blue Album is still more unique in how it's written. Because, again, it takes a lot of that disenfranchisement that Nirvana and Pearl Jam and other bands of their ilk, were trying to create a sound, a voice for, but made it more indebted to their own personal sort of feelings, and the attention to detail on the vocal harmonies and all that sort of stuff. I think just kind of resonate in a bigger way to dorkier musicians sort of picking up a guitar and becoming bigger, things in music. Like In Nevermind's case, again, it brought not only other bands in their scene to success, it immediately brought so many other underground bands a huge amount of success. And I think that is undeniable. You know, the shake up in music that Nevermind brought is something you cannot look over. I gotta fucking burp again. Jeez, I'm so burpy. I'm sorry. That one snuck up on me. I knew it was coming, but it came out sooner than I was planning. That one didn't. And you could argue for worse that Nirvana and all of those other bands wrought in the era of post-grunge, something that a lot of people, myself included, are not the biggest fan of collectively. I will say one other great offshoot from Nevermind and Nirvana as a whole, but Nevermind brought in Dave Grohl to do drums, and he became an integral part of Nevermind's sound. It's my favorite aspect of Nevermind personally. I love Dave's thunderous drumming on it, and I think that even from Smells Like Teen Spirit's opening drum beats, it sets a precedent for the sound of the record, and something that, again, is undeniably ear-grabbing. You know, while I like Bleach and I like their original drummer just fine, I'm gonna look up his name real quick because I don't fucking remember what it is. I'm a terrible podcaster. What the fuck? What the fuck? I just want to know his name. Why were there 9 different people in Nirvana at one point? Chad Channing. Chad Channing. His drumming was fine on Bleach. You know, I think Bleach is a good record. It's got really good songs, you know. It's got it's got About a Girl. That's a great song. It's got Negative Creep. That song is sludgy as fuck. It's got Floyd the Barber. It's got Mr. Mustache. And Nevermind is just a huge step above that, you know? That elongated, distorted, warping note on Smells Like Teen Spirit is something I cannot unhear after I watched this documentary about Nevermind, breaking down the behind the scenes. And there's a lot of work that went into this record as well, from a layering perspective. Kurt's vocals and how they were layered is incredible. You know, the bass work by Chris Novoselic is really tight and fits in the pocket. You know, those guitars cut through like a fucking buzzsaw. You know, Butch mastered it and engineered it in a way that just fucking kills. You know, I like the production on Nevermind a fuck ton. I think that it's amazing. Again, not my favorite grunge record, but there's a lot to be said about how incredible it sounds from a sonic perspective, whether it is those gnashing moments like the singles of In Bloom and Smells Like Teen Spirit, or the fucking territorial pissings guitar lines. Fuck, dude. But it also produces the soft moments really well as well, like Something in the Way, the closer, like that intimate feeling that really destroys the bridge between musician and listener. You know, Kurt feels right there like I am. He's just in your ears talking to you. You know, he's very, very quiet, and he speaks to your soul. And there's a lot to be said, you know, about how important that is and how important it was at the time. You know, it's an incredible record. But what I was getting to that tangent. Foo Fighters were an offshoot of Nirvana. Foo Fighters are amazing. They're a great rock band. You know, they fucking did a lot of good things for rock music. And they were an offshoot of Nirvana. Not necessarily Nevermind, but again, Nevermind's impact was that was the catalyst. It was the catalytic point at which music was changed. And Weezer, their Blue album, I feel like just has more of a long-lasting resonance, because I feel like if you look at the threads of Nirvana's impact, you know, I don't think it helps that other grunge bands have stood around Nirvana. Again, Nirvana's career was kind of cut short. You can definitely see the bloodlines of Nirvana's Nevermind and Nirvana in general through bands like Wolf Alice and other bands that tried to come up into this second era of grunge. But Weezer's Blue album, I feel like just and again, it's a band whose career is still going on, but they haven't really topped Blue. Like, this was just an iconic start to their career, you know, because of Rick Ocasek's production, because of how crunchy the guitars sound, but how well they mix with the drums and the vocal harmonies and the vocal hooks, and how catchy it is, and how powerful it all feels. You know, you could see the threads of it throughout a lot of music, you know. Not to say that it was sort of the catalyst for contemporary pop punk, because there were other bands that were more punky that were a part of that, but I feel like they definitely had a hand in it, at least in their guitar's production. You look at guitar production in pop punk, it sounds in line with stuff like what Green Day was doing on Dookie, but it also sounds very in line with how Weezer was doing it. You know, Wheatus, Teenage Dirtbag, all those kind of songs, those higher pitched vocal bands, I feel like they drew a line from Weezer immediately. But if you look at the threads of music, you know, your Coed and Cambrias, you know, your more ambitious progressive bands that are a little dorkier, feel like they owe a little bit, at least, to Weezer's sound for making it cool again. You know, for making it cool to be a guitar, you know, loving, solo, adoring guy who is a little more introspective. You know, in the garages, you know, totes of D&D and stuff, and just hanging out in the garage. Like, that's, personally, I'm a bigger fan of the Blue Album, and it may sound like I'm bringing a bias into it by saying that. And that can play into it as well, you know, and that's something we'll talk about in the show. But I feel like the longer lasting net positive impact Weezer has had with the Blue Album, I feel like eclipses any sort of immediate success Nirvana wrought because of Nevermind. And again, you can make the argument Blue would not exist without Nevermind. And if that's your leg to stand on, I can't refute that, because I'm sure that there is some thread. Like, there's that conspiracy theory that Rivers Cuomo is just Kurt Cobain, you know. So there's a lot of legs that has to stand on, and I'm not going to refute that. If that's your argument in the comments, I kind of agree with you. And again, this could be just personal bias. I personally prefer the Blue Album to Nevermind, because I feel like other bands also made music in the same style as Nirvana, but there weren't really bands doing Weezer in Weezer's era, and I feel like that speaks bigger volumes. You know, if it weren't Nirvana, I can see Pearl Jam getting bigger with 10 and their follow-up with Go. I could see Soundgarden getting big with Super Unknown. You know, I could see Alice in Chains getting big with Dirt that came out just a year later. There were a lot of bands doing this sound. I think Nirvana just for some reason struck the perfect chord at the perfect time. You know, Weezer's Blue Album just has this huge sense of 90s embedded in its core still, like Nirvana, but in a completely different way that I feel like was also resonant to a lot of things going on in the 90s, in the pop punk scene, in the popular scene, you know. I feel like they did a very good job at creating this sound that was relatively sad and relatively I don't know what I'm trying to say, relatively niche, and gave it an audience, gave it a sound in a way that Nirvana just didn't hit. You know, while you could throw your threads to, again, your popular post-grunge acts like the Foo Fighters because they had a direct link, or if you're into that sort of thing, bands like Puddle of Mud and the Creeds and all those big bands that popped in the late 90s that were riding the grunge wave well past its expiration date. You know, bands like Stone Temple Pilots that came up around the same time but a little later. You could argue were influenced by Nirvana's sound, but again, they were kind of just a piece of a puzzle. You know, I feel like bands like, again, your 2000s pop punk to a degree, your Fall Out Boys, your to a lesser degree your OK Go's, because they were kind of influenced by a bunch of other bands, but that big guitar crunch, with nice solo work wasn't a thing until Weezer made it cool again. They contemporized 70s rock in a 90s sort of way that I don't think people ignore, but I feel like when talking about resonance an album has, Nevermind is the immediate thing people go to, whereas Weezer's Blue is not something that, and it's not denied, because I obviously, and another thing I'm going to talk about later is the results, because I do these polls on my Instagram, again, as I mentioned earlier, about which do you think cast under the umbrella more, and I'll get to that in a minute. But there's so many bands from the late 90s, early 2000s that include a lot of sonic dynamics that are seen in Blue, and to a lesser extent Pinkerton, in a way that I feel like resonate to a more modern sense. The net that they cast was just so much wider, because nobody sounded like Weezer. Other pop punk bands existed in the 90s, but they weren't doing what Weezer was doing, and that's why I feel like that's my argument for why the Blue album is more long-term impactful than Nirvana. Because not to say grunge is out of fashion. Like I said, bands like Wolf Alice still exist, and there's always a band trying to stir up the grunge sound again. It just doesn't hit the same chord that Nirvana and Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam were doing in their heyday, and I feel like that's the important part about the longevity part. But to shift gears, because I feel like I'm talking in circles a little bit, which I apologize, sort of a first episode. I've done podcasts before, but they have never been solo. They've never been me sitting in front of you with a microphone to talk about a subject, and that's why I'm going to be bringing guests in. Similarly to Roguelite Run, I will have a guest come in, and we'll talk about a subject, or I'll talk about two records that fall under an umbrella, and talk about which we think falls under that umbrella better. Some of them will be ones I've done on the Instagram, and I'll be doing all new ones on the Instagram as well. It's not going to fade away from the Instagram. It's just going to be a podcast now, and I'll be trying to bring in guests relatively frequently, again, at least until I can get consistent guests, because if that's the goal, consistent guests. But I'm not going to keep badgering my friends to come onto a podcast with me, because I feel like it's not a nice thing to do. We all got stuff going on, even though we're in a quarantine right now. We got a lot of stuff going on. Everybody does, and I don't want to impose on somebody's work. So there'll probably be more other ones like this where I'm sitting down talking about both records, talking about songs, talking about production, talking about the sounds, and talking about where the sounds carried, what resonance they had in their respective scenes. But there will also be a segment where I sit down and look through the poll results on my Instagram. If there's ever comments on the polls, I will also address those and talk about them. So I encourage you, if you do vote in one of my polls, be sure to comment. Leave a comment. We'll talk about it. This is going to be an open conversation. I love talking to people about music. It's why I have a channel. I may talk about non-music things. Some would say a little more than music, but I care a lot about the music content that I make, and I want to keep it an engaging thing for people to enjoy. But the polls. This was the first episode. This was the first poll I made, so I made it the first episode. I'm not going to do them in sequential order. Like, next podcast isn't going to be about Is This It versus Turn on the Bright Lights. That was almost the first episode, but I was like, I'm going to do Blue and Nevermind, just because I have what some would consider, not judging by the poll results, but some would consider a hot take to say that Weezer, in the long run, has had more of an impact than Nirvana's Nevermind. Again, I'm not saying Nirvana's Nevermind's a bad album. I like that record. I think it's pretty good. It's not my favorite Nirvana record. It's not my favorite grunge record, but I like it. And the poll on Instagram sided with me. Blue won by one vote over Nevermind. Now, that's not to say you could chalk that up to a few things. Viewer base, I've made countless videos about Weezer. Not to say I love Weezer. I do really like Weezer. I think they've made some shitty fucking records, but they've made some incredible records. I have not made nearly as much content on Nirvana. This is, I think, the first time I've really talked about Nirvana. And it's Nevermind, which is a record that everybody knows. I grew up with this record before I got into Weezer. not too far off. I had listened to both a lot growing up, but Weezer was just in heavier rotation, and it's just a band that I gravitate to towards more. Even if as a disenfranchised teen, I felt more in line with Kurt Cobain's edgy sadness. He just hit my core so much better, man. I always kept going back to Weezer because I like their songs as well. And, I'm if you couldn't tell by the other half of the coin of the content I make, I'm kind of a dorky guy. I'm kind of a fucking nerdy guy. So I resonated with some of the lyrics on the Blue album as well. But I feel like that's not necessarily a Taylor reason why, because some people actually surprised me in the votes for Blue versus Nevermind. But Blue did come out on top. But I understand any arguments some may have for Blue, bias aside, because it's undeniable what it had, what immediate impact it had on music. It's a record that had hit people really hard, really fast. And that kind of shows in the Nevermind results. Some of the people that voted, like my dad voted in the poll, he voted for Nevermind. Again, not a huge surprise. I know he likes him some Nirvana. But the people that did vote Blue, it made sense. They were a little more in the camp that I am in, as being a more nerdier leaning guy. Some of them were, or they have a huge preference to Weezer, so it's clear why they put that on their plate. They enjoyed that record more, or they found it more impactful. The poll, the question I put in hand was, which album do you like more / think is better, which is Blue versus Nevermind. But it struck the root of the conversation stemmed from a conversation I had with my buddy CJ, who I will have on the podcast because he likes talking music as well. We talked about these records, and he said Nevermind was more impactful. And I understood his argument, and I kept bringing up some of the things I said here, but some of the things were things that I had thought about over time. But I still stand by what I said. I still think that Blue is the more long-term impactful record of the 90s iconic rock outings. That's about it. I don't know how long I've gone for. What I'm going by on my recording is beats, because I'm recording into GarageBand. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'm sorry if I got a little rambly. I had my thoughts kind of laid out, but as I kind of sat down to talk about them, some were fleeting and some weren't. And some of my ideas were a little more concrete. And it's also a pilot. I'm just kind of testing the waters, seeing how you guys like a podcast from me. How you like me talking about music in a little more of a long-form forum. Again, next time I will have a guest. I have a guest in mind, and I have a subject in mind. I just need to get with them and see when they're available to record it. And I have other guests in mind for other things. I have a handful of episodes in mind to do for this show, and I hope that you'll join me along the road, along the way with them. Thank you so much for listening. If you did like this podcast, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more on my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons. If you would like to join their ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or help drive the community, it is linked in the description. What did you think of this podcast? What do you think of the idea of it? Where do you sit in the Nirvana Blue sort of spectrum? I wouldn't be surprised if I talked about comments of the podcast and the topics at hand in future episodes at the beginning as sort of a revisiting of the subject before I talked about the new subject. So I would encourage that if you guys do want to continue this conversation in the comments down below. And I'll be jumping in there intermittently, injecting thoughts, injecting ideas in my thoughts on your thoughts. We're sharing thoughts. Sorry, I had to burp again. I shouldn't drink booze before I sit down to record a podcast. Yeah. Blue and Nevermind. Incredible classics. Records that I think are both worth their weight in gold and worth the praise they've been given. But yeah, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you again so very much for listening. I have been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations. And I will see you another day.